So starting off, when it comes to water visuals and overall seascapes, it's important to know what drives the main sort of visual appearance of water. And in this case, it's usually, much like in the real world, the sky. So this can be a bit of a lengthy process to set up the sky and everything. So we've kind of started off with one of our preset maps. So in our latest Waterline update, if you were to go to the Waterline folder, Ocean Sim, Maps, Preset Maps, and we have all of these sort of pre-made maps with different lighting and stuff. We have sort of a nice lagoon. The important thing is to hit Ocean Simulation to get these. We have a sort of rougher looking North Sea for a more stormy location. The Indian Ocean, another scary looking stormy sea. But for our case, we decided to start with something like the Atlantic preset. It has a fairly well set up lighting system, but whoops, for the overall visuals of this, let's do a few things. So first of all, let's make sure that no upscaling is being done. So we're going to set our screen percentage to 100. Next up, we're going to use the console command rejection flickering to 0 to give us an even sharper image, and we're pretty much good to go. So for this case, we want a sort of neutral looking ocean almost, and to do that we'll start making some tweaks to the ocean simulation. So from the get-go, this preset is pretty well set to give us the maximum number of details, and what we're going to do is basically start tweaking some things like the ocean magnitude. One more thing I would like to adjust is to set the exposure to something neutral like 0 so we can have a better idea of what we're doing. So let's start. So overall we have the FFT resolution at 2K, so this is the highest possible we can have at the moment. In terms of textile size, 5 is good though. We can lower it with 2K to something like 2.5 to get slightly more normal detail, although we kind of have plenty of that at the moment. Next up, let's see, to get a calmer looking ocean, ideally we would like to be adjusting the wind speed. So in this case we have something like 20, which is creating these larger swells. So for a more normal looking ocean, calmer rather, let's go with something like 8. And all of a sudden this is giving us something a lot more neutral. And let's see, is there anything else we would like to do? We might be getting a little bit too much noise, so let's see. We can adjust something like the micro displacement. If we outright turn it off, our ocean is a little too smooth. We'll lose a bit too much detail. So maybe we can just adjust this level of detail here to something like 3 and 3 like so. Next up, micro displacement height. This is a bit of a noise sort of filter additionally on top of our ocean. So something that we could do is lower the mask to something like 20, because otherwise we can get some really horrible looking seams. And maybe adjust the height to something like 5. Whoops, clearly too much. 2 is pretty good. So we have a pretty nice detailed ocean. Maybe 1.5. So there we go. So the initial overall visuals for this scene were up in the air, so something like this, and pretty much off the bat we've kind of done a couple of adjustments and we're getting pretty close. So next up, let's look at some of the things we could do to the ocean material itself. So now that we've opened our ocean surface material instance here, we can start adjusting some of these settings. Now overall this is a pretty good setup, so we don't need to change too much, but something that we could do is actually push the specular wave of the crest a bit more higher than 1, so something like 4, and instantly we're getting a bit more sunlight contribution here. Now a little trick that we like to use to get extra detail is to use this console command R, whoops, tone mapper sharpen, something like 5 in this case, because this is a 4K display, so 5 is really kind of nice. If you're something like on an HD display, 1 or 2 are generally where you'd want to go, but in this case we're going to go with a really high value just because we have a bit more pixels to play around with before the effect sort of starts to getting a little overwhelming. Next up, we're going to be adjusting the shallow water clarity to make things a little bit more transparent, so 0.08 like so. And finally we're going to adjust the deep water clarity, so to make the overall water appear darker, and we're going to set it to something very low, 0.001. We're still getting a little bit of color, but it's going to be super dark. And overall, if you're happy with this, well, yeah, this is something that you could use. But for this sort of scene, we were looking for something closer to this. So a bit more murkier, a bit darker. And finally, something that you can also adjust is this sort of a subsurface scattering that we have here. Now, in our case, this is sort of controlled by its own separate blueprint. Let's get it here. And, you know, because it's a separate directional blueprint, you can kind of fine-tune this a bit more if you want. So increase it, lower it. In this case, let's have it as a very, whoops. Let's sort of disable the angle snapping. Something like this. So it's like a very slight and subtle effect in this case. So yeah, overall, we're happy with our ocean, and we can start sort of putting the scene together. So next up, let's just add a quick exponential height fog just to better blend the environment with the water and everything. So place actor, fog, drag and drop, and things are going to look terrible at the beginning. So let's adjust a couple of parameters. First of all, let's drop the fog density to something super low like so, and adjust the height fall off to another low number, 0.033 should be good. Now the idea is to get some really nice fog sort of in the distance. We don't really want anything in the camera for this shot, which is also why for our max start distance, we're actually going to push the fog a bit back with a value of 100,000. And yeah, overall on this end, this is what we'll be doing in terms of the fog itself. So once we're sort of happy with everything, we could just start to hit Control L and start playing around a little bit with the sunlight just so we can get some nice looking specular highlights from the water, bit of detail from the waves, and some nice colors. So ultimately, I think something like this should be sufficient. So next up, just to get the best possible visuals, what we did was drop in a post-process volume, set it to unbound like so. And next up, in terms of global illumination, we're going to set this to lumen. Lumen GI generally looks as good as the full-on ray tracing. Just to note that this video is in Unreal Engine 5.1, so later versions may not have the full-on ray tracing. But in terms of GI, Lumen pretty much looks identical to it, and in some cases even slightly better. However, in terms of reflections, we want to use standalone ray tracing because it just looks really good once we start placing assets. Next up, in terms of global illumination, we just kind of cranked these all the way up to get the best possible visuals. And yeah, to enable ray tracing, you may need to go into your project settings and search ray tracing, and you need to enable support ray tracing, ray trace shadows, sky, and so on and so forth. Make sure to have shader model 6 enabled, and your RHI should be DirectX 12, and you'll be good to go. Next up, in terms of assets, what we imported was the huge Nordic coastal cliff, huge Nordic coastal cliff again, massive Nordic coastal cliff, and the other massive Nordic coastal cliff. So really the entire scene is made up of these 4 assets. So now that we have everything set up, let's just enable the ocean simulation. Something else, let's add in the 5 and flickering to 0 and set the screen percentage to 100. Cool. So once we sort of have a nice overall camera vantage point, so say we want to build our scene from this sort of perspective or something, we can hit Control 1 on our keyboard. And the cool thing is this will create a sort of a camera bookmark so we can move around and stuff, but whenever we hit 1, we'll be back to this sort of area. And this allows us to pretty much start placing assets. So let's go to our content browser. And let's just grab our static meshes from Quixel that we just got, and we can start dragging and dropping them as needed. So hit 1 again, and let's start making something interesting. So to speed the process along, we've kind of done a first pass of the way of the cliffs, and overall what we did was just kind of place our camera here, and really from this sort of perspective started building out the coastline. So we're kind of moving around blocks. Now we're trying to make this like a pretty quick sort of scene that's going to be fairly static without too many camera angles. So the limitation of this approach is that if you start moving around, you will start seeing seams, but with additional models and stuff, these can all be sort of fixed up as well. So the scene is fairly basic. If we go here, we just kind of have the massive Nordic coastal cliff, and we're just kind of twisting it and placing it around until we get like an overall nice visual of it. Something cool that you could do is with a few models, you could sometimes inverse their scale to flip them around and make things more interesting, just to get a bit more, whoops, and distort them to get more variations with fewer assets. In this case, pretty much the entire level is going to be built out of 4. Next up, we're just layering additional assets just for these extra details, the way they blend. We are using nanite, so we're not too worried about poly counts here. And realistically, maybe we could push this a bit backwards or something so we can get a nicer blend. Overall here, we're using a different model just to get this sort of a cliff face sticking out. In our case, we really are just playing here with the shadows and getting the most of the shapes here without getting too much repetition, because you could kind of tell that this model and this model are the same. So we're really going to be blending them a bit closer, and let's see if this cliff, we could rotate it a bit. Maybe give it a bit more of an inclination, but we're seeing a bit of a gap there. So overall, this is, I think, what we're going to go with. Next up, let's just add a bit. I decided to add a bit more details in the far distance, so the scene has a bit more depth. If we go back to 2, this is pretty much it. And yeah, so phase 2 is just kind of continuing to build upon from the overall details we have. We've added a bit more details in the distance in terms of these cliffs. When you move the camera, they don't look too great, but with our sort of fixed position that we're planning on, it's looking pretty decent. Next up, we just added a bit of an extra sort of details here to give it a bit more character. Whoops. And yeah, some tiny debris that would have broken off from the main cliffs. And this is looking pretty interesting at the moment. And generally, this could be pretty much good enough. But there's something else that we could do to take it a step further, and that is to add a bit more underwater details, as these are like the other main component of, well, overall water appearance. Now, if you remember initially, we kind of lowered our shallow water clarity and our deep water clarity, and that means that if we get close here, our water is fairly nice and translucent, so we can start placing meshes in it. So how do we do this with these assets? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's just grab something like this. Now it's gonna freak out a little bit, and well, let's just squish it and see what happens. So these particular assets are pretty good for this because they have some nice sort of green details on them, and that just kind of makes it look like they're covered in seaweed and overgrown. So we're just gonna place it something like this. Maybe squish it even further. And now you're seeing that we're getting some really nice underwater details. And getting a little bit of a coastline here. And if we start placing it around here, and just carefully position it so it doesn't actually clip through the water, you could see that our scene is getting quite a bit more depth. Now we could also shrink it a bit, so we're getting more sort of details for it. But yeah, overall, this is the sort of game plan we have. So maybe just a little bit poking through where the waves are crashing and some sort of seaweeds are growing. And yeah, this is going to be like sort of our next step. So yeah, this is pretty much where we're at the moment. We've placed a couple of these meshes and then just kind of placed them around here. So it kind of gives this nice slope of sort of the idea that rocks have been falling down and building up around this coast and they're overgrown with seaweed. Realistically, this is like a Quixel asset with grass on it, but in this case, it does the job pretty well. So finally, we kind of like the idea of these little rocks that we have here that are just kind of poking out of the water. So I'm going to be placing like a couple of hero assets around here from the peak, just so it appears it's pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to just grab maybe one of these and again, squish it and it's looking pretty good and just have it sort of poke around the water. Whoops. We can press 2 to reset our camera and just have it sort of here so it looks like it's broken off from the actual cliff. We can expand it a bit and just kind of position it here a bit better. And yeah, so it's kind of blending the overall cliff above the water with the one that's beneath it. Maybe we can add in a bit of height. And yeah, we're basically going to be doing this for a bit until we get the results that we kind of want. So once we're happy with all the placements, this is pretty much what we have. A sort of nice sort of breaking point from this sort of main cliff. Looking quite natural, a bit of debris at the bottom. We're not too worried about details here because of the water refraction. We'll just kind of blur it anyway at this distance, but it looks overall nice and believable. There are a couple of things that we can do to take this to the next level. And one of those is to add a very basic decal material. So we're going to call it wetness. And this is pretty much what it looks like. We've created a material, make sure its material domain is deferred decal, blend mode translucent. And we just kind of have controls for color, specular, roughness, and for opacity, we have a world position, and we're just kind of taking the height of it. And this will kind of blurry the top part of the mask. We don't really care about the bottom one because we could kind of cut this off sharply within the decal actor itself. And we have for how it blends and a little bit of an offset so we can control it a bit easier. And let's just give this a quick save. And if we go here, we also have a material instance right here that we've just kind of already set up, but for the sake of it, let's just create a new one. And let's go back to our fixed camera. And something that we could do is just simply drag and drop this. And initially, it's going to be a fairly small looking area. So something like this. And let's place it near our larger, cliffs, like so. So you can actually start seeing what it does. And this is a pretty good testing place. So first of all, we're going to be expanding its scale to something like, maybe not all the way to 50. 10 is good. 50 like so. And we're seeing that nothing much is happening. So chances are we do need to make a couple of adjustments on the material instance side. So first of all, a lot of these are set to zeros and roughness. And let's start adjusting these. And there we go. Once we start messing with the offset, we can see that it starts to appear. And with the blend, actually going to lower it so we get a smoother overall. So now that we've set the blend to a very low value, we're sort of getting this nice and smooth transition to what we want. And what do we want? Well, we want this to be a sort of a layer for where the water has been hitting the rock repeatedly. So we're just going to adjust maybe leave the specular at 0.5. Adjust the roughness to something like 0.3 so it's nice and shiny. We can also change the base color, but overall maybe something like this. Let's just grab our original material instance that we had here and place that instead of endless sort of tweaking. So why did we choose slightly different numbers? Well, that is basically because of our camera. And something that we could do now is increase its X and Y scale, because right now it's affecting this little square. And let's do something like 500, 500. And we really are looking if it's big enough to encapsulate all of the cliffs. And so far it's looking pretty good. We have a sort of nice wetness that blends these rocks with the underwater. Something that we do not want is for this sort of darkness to be affecting our underwater assets that we placed here. So let's position this a little bit higher. Something like so. So ideally, if we were to get closer, we don't want to see this sort of gap, but at the same time, we want our underwater to be free of this effect. So overall, just a little update on the decal. We ended up going with these sort of scale settings because they gave us a sort of sharp transition below the decal and a smooth one above. And that is pretty much ideal to have the assets sort of blend upwards and be cut off so it doesn't affect our underwater assets. But something else that we did is that, well, with this particular asset just didn't look great. And some of these as well, we kind of wanted them to be a bit more sun bleached, and maybe the waves here are generally calmer with larger waves just kind of crashing in the background, whereas the sea here would be generally smoother. So how can we sort of have a very big decal affecting only some of the assets? Well, you can select your cliff here and just type decal, and disable receives decal. Now, if we have it enabled, we can see that these entire sort of cliffs here are become really dark, and this can be technically realistic, but for our purposes, including, let's see, these ones, it didn't look that great. So we just kind of disabled it for these ones. So these may be slightly unrealistic, but the overall effect is a bit better. So something else that we could do is add foam just to really ground these sort of rocks to the water. And for that, we'll be using another asset of ours called WaterStamp. So let's see about adding some WaterStamps to this scene. Well, let's go to our content browser, and we have WaterStamp here. I'm going to go to Base, Meshes, and we're going to grab this particular mesh because this is the one that works best with oceans. Gonna grab it here and just sort of really make it much bigger so we can actually see what it's doing. And the cool thing about WaterStamp is that it is basically like a decal system for water materials. If we go here, materials, we would be looking for foam material here, and let's grab this one. And off the bat, let's just have the texture load up a bit more. We can see that it looks pretty horrible in this case. We're just kind of getting some horrible masking from the box, and well, that is normal. So what we're going to do is simply open up the material and first of all, adjust the tiling. So lower it a bit more, and we could start adjusting the sort of bounds of this mesh a bit more. Now, the important thing is that the mesh encapsulates the top side and the bottom side of the waves. And we could just place it something like that. And if we go back to our standard viewport, we could adjust it, rotate it. Now, this is a slightly older version of Waterline that we're using here. We have a new update, and the difference is that this one will not work with shadows correctly. Our latest version supports that. So yeah, keep in mind here we're doing a couple of reworks around it, and one of it is to sort of manually adjust the colors a bit to sort of blend it with the ocean a bit better. And let's see, we're just kind of looking for something a bit more subtle like this. Next up, this also comes with a library of kind of pre-made textures, so we could test out different sort of looks. This is looking pretty good for a sort of radial kind of approach, maybe something like this. And of course, we should put the normal map for it to match, though at this distance, it doesn't really make too much a difference. This sort of animation that we're seeing here is adjusted by these sort of distortion parameters here. So we can have big, slow distortions or lots of small, wiggly ones. And of course, these two parameters here show how much the distortion is being made. We can adjust the opacity a bit. And yeah, so next up, we're just gonna copy and paste this and just kind of adjust them as needed. So yeah, stay tuned for the end of this sort of setting. So overall, these are the kind of water stamps that we decided to use for our sort of close-up hero cliffs. This is the overall material that we did the adjustments to, sort of mainly tweaking the colors and selecting the third mask. And something else that we did is just placed a couple of really big, more or less low-res water stamps in the distance to better ground these cliffs. And if we turn them on, this is what they kind of look like. So if we zoom in, you're getting this sort of nice large foams. The idea of being like big sort of stormy waves just around the corner, just give the scene, make it a bit more interesting. And overall, this is pretty much what we've done. This is what these look like. Now, these are just kind of copies of the overall water stamp material that we did there, which is why they sort of, when you get up close, they don't look too great. You can adjust these tiling animations like we showed before to make them stand up close. So one final sort of touch up that we could do to this is do some color grading. And to do that, we're just going to grab a quick screenshot. So once you have the screenshot that you've kind of grabbed, you can just go into pretty much any sort of software. In either Photoshop is more popular, or in this case, we're using Affinity Pro. And we can just start making some color adjustments. So in this case, we went quite aggressively with our color correction, and we wanted to kind of shift the mood a bit, something a bit colder. So we have some color curves, some hue, saturation, selective color, curves again. And this is kind of like the overall final thing that we ended up with. And once you're happy with this, something that you can do is just go to this sort of website over here. It's in the Unreal Engine. Basically, just look up Unreal Engine LUTs or color lookup tables. And once you have this asset, right click and save as. So finally, we open up this table in our software as well. So Affinity or Photoshop, whatever. The important thing is that when you click Save As, you make sure it's a PNG. And once we have the layers with the color adjustments and corrections that we want, we simply Control-C and Control-V them on top of this table. And we save it again as a PNG. So we have our modified color lookup table here. We've called it Coast LUT. And what we need to do is go to the outliner, post-process volume, and search for LUT. And we're going to enable color grading LUT and simply drag and drop this. And everything's going to look much, much more horrible than what we're used to. So what's up? Well, we need to open this asset up and make sure that it is set under texture group. Let's see, color lookup table. So let's change that. And instantly our scene became good. We can save this change. And there we go. We pretty much have that same thing from the screenshot. And because of the way we've kind of set things up, we could have some nice sort of fly through. Something else that we used for this project, I think you may have spotted, is virtual shadow maps. These were still in beta in 5.1, but they looked pretty great. Something to note is that when we were turning on all of the ray tracing, we made sure specifically that our directional light is not using ray trace shadows, because the reason for this is that ray trace shadows at the moment do not appear on water surfaces. So if we use project settings, they're pretty much gone. So yeah, that's just a little bit of a additional quality setting. And yeah, overall, this was just like a quick video to show you how this scene was constructed, a little bit of the overall thinking process behind it. We plan on doing a couple more of these tutorials, so yeah, stay tuned for more.